Howdy and welcome back to Wild West Deep Dives. In this series, I will be diving into each of the 5 civilized tribes, their history, their removal to the territory, and their modern day history. After that, I'm going to focus on more of the migration of white settlers into the territory and why Indian territory became so lawless. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. The 5 civilized tribes consisted of the Cherokee, the Muscogee, also known as the Creeks, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Seminoles. Each had their own customs and traditions. I think the best way to do this is go through each one individually so it doesn't get too confusing. I'm also going to try to not make it too repetitive with this was their custom, this was the treaty they signed, this was their removal, but all have similar stories, but I think it's important to tell the story of each one and the hardships they went through. The focus is going to be on the removal to Indian Territory, to modern-day Oklahoma. All the tribes had some removal prior to the 1830 Indian Removal Act, in which they were removed west to Arkansas Territory, but the primary focus will be on the removals post-1830. This is also not going to be a deep dive into each tribe, but a brief overview, so don't yell at me if I'm missing certain details or events, but please yell at me if I get something wrong. As always, I strive for accuracy. wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. Please be nice. The first tribe we are going to discuss is the Cherokee, the largest of the 5 civilized tribes. They called themselves, bear with me here, Aniunia, or Principal People. According to Visit Cherokee Nation, one of their many origin stories goes as so. The Cherokee people lived on an island south of what is now the United States. Their island became tormented by earthquakes that led to a volcanic eruption. Approximately 14 groups departed in canoes to find a new home. The people set forth across a vast expanse of water, traveling for weeks. Not every canoe survived this dangerous journey. Only 7 canoe groups remained when they reached the shores of an unfamiliar land. These groups would become the 7 Cherokee clans: Wolf, Blue, Longhair, Paint, Bird, Deer, and Wild Potato. The 7 groups traveled north to the land of the Iroquois, in the northeast of the present-day United States. There, the Cherokee lived among the Iroquois for a brief time, until they began their own journey, heading south and east where they settled, living in towns and communities and becoming the Cherokee Nation. According to the National Park Service, quote, "The ancestors of the Cherokee are considered part of the later Pisgah phase of the South Appalachian Mississippian culture, a period where ceremonial mounds were built in a town with numerous smaller villages around it. The earliest recorded contact between Europeans and the Mississippian culture occurred when members of Hernando de Soto's expedition contacted the Cherokee tribe in 1540. The Cherokee Nation had been identified as one of the most advanced among the contacted native tribes, and after first contact, the society continued to develop. They lived in permanent villages centralized around ceremonial mounds. These villages were located near large river bottoms, which made it perfect for agriculture. The Cherokee tribe was a combination of 7 different clans, according to Cherokee Phoenix. These are the 7 clans. I'm going to attempt to say their names in Cherokee, but if I mispronounce them, I'm sorry. I'm trying my best. Anigilohai, which translates to long hair. Anisahoni, which means blue. Aniwaya, wolf. Anigotijiwi, wild potato. Aniawi, deer, Anitisigwa, bird, and Aniwodi, which means paint. Each member of the clan they belonged to were considered brother and sisters, and it was forbidden to marry within your own clan. Women traditionally were very powerful, seen as the givers of life through childbirth and givers of food through agriculture. They owned the household and the land. They were often community leaders. According to Oklahoma history, quote, "A beloved woman in a council of women had substantial power, including the right to declare war." By the late 18th century, the Cherokee territory had been firmly established amongst other native tribes and European settlers. Their lands contained most of modern-day Tennessee, parts of southeast North Carolina, northern Georgia and Alabama, and a small part of Kentucky. A picture of the map will be listed in the show notes. Also in the 18th century, a series of smallpox caused devastation amongst the native tribes, who had no immunity to these European diseases. Smallpox is a communicable disease brought here by both American and Africans when the slaves came to South Carolina in 1738. The smallpox disease wiped out 50% of the Cherokee Nation because they were located on the eastern coast. Post-Revolutionary War, the United States was officially their own country, and one thing was on everyone's mind: expansion. This next bit is for every tribe, not just the Cherokee, so I'll use this as kind of a bookmark. If you need a refresher later on, you can always come back to this. So whenever you hear me say assimilation or civilizing, this is what I'm talking about. As the United States sought to expand its territory, American settlers began to encroach upon native lands. Key figures in this migration effort were Secretary of War Henry Knox and the first president, George Washington. They believed that the path to lasting peace lay in civilizing or assimilating Native American tribes into American culture. Their vision included transforming Native Americans into farmers, encouraging them to abandon their nomadic lifestyles. While some tribes had a rich agricultural history, the US government overlooked a crucial aspect of Native American culture. Land was not seen as a commodity to own. Instead, it was viewed as a resource to sustain life, with control over it contingent upon one's ability to defend it. But no one owned the land. But the United States government wanted them to abandon their migrating lifestyle and live on a certain plot of land, adopt the same clothes and European family lifestyle, learn to speak English, and convert to Christianity. Even Christian missionaries were sent to assist in converting these natives to the European way of life. They taught arithmetic, housekeeping, table etiquette, and reading and writing. Now back to focusing on the Cherokee. The Cherokee adopted some ideas that they seemed as useful, and rejected those that they deemed useless. But the Cherokee soon realized that the overall goal of America was expansion, and their council leaders met to discuss how they would deal with it, with some wanting more, especially the young warriors, while others wanted to negotiate a peace treaty. This caused many to start looking west for new land that they could live in peace, and by the year 1817, the Cherokee had signed a treaty with the United States, known as the Cherokee Treaty of 1817, that essentially traded their territory in the east for new territory in modern-day Arkansas, and approximately a third of the Cherokee Nation migrated west. But around 1810, a Cherokee by the name of Sequoyah began work on a project that he believed would bridge the gap between Native American culture and Euro-American culture. Sequoyah worked tirelessly, and in 1821, he finished his work on creating a written Cherokee language. The Cherokee tried to show that they had assimilated. In 1825, they found a new capital called New Echota. In 1827, they formed a Cherokee Constitution that was to serve as their own constitution for their lands, similar to that of the United States. And in 1828, the first edition of their own newspaper was public, the Cherokee Phoenix. But this did little, and in 1828, Sequoyah went with a delegation of West Cherokees to Washington, D.C., and signed a new treaty, known as the Treaty of 1828, which again traded their lands in western Arkansas for land in Indian Territory, which was located in modern-day Oklahoma. These first migrants earned the nickname of Old Settlers for being the first ones of the tribe to settle in the lands of the West. Although the Cherokee Nation tried to assimilate and adapt to American culture, their lands were being further and further encroached on by settlers. When gold was discovered on their land in 1830, it led President Andrew Jackson to pass the Indian Removal Act. This next bit again will be more pertaining to all tribes, not just the Cherokee, but the native tribes at this point, 1830, have fought against the United States armies for years now, and realized that they could not defeat them in war. The native tribes could not keep up with the manpower, the weapons, and technology of the United States Army. Add on top of this that American settlers were growing ever hungry for more land, it led the native tribes to try to negotiate with the United States to give up a large portion of their land. The reason is that they hoped by giving a good portion of their land, it would allow them to keep some of it. Unfortunately, this did not work. According to the United States Office of the Historian, the Constitution gave Congress the power to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. In early treaties negotiated between the federal government and the Indian tribes, The latter typically acknowledge themselves to be under the protection of the United States of America and no other sovereign whosoever. Andrew Jackson used these legal precedents when he asked Congress to adopt the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The United States Office of the Historian explains it as follows, quote, "The act established a process whereby the president could grant land west of the Mississippi River to Indian tribes that agreed to give up their homelands. As incentives, the law allowed the Indians financial and material assistance to travel to their new locations and start new lives, and guaranteed that the Indians would live on their new property under the protection of the United States government forever." Well, as the act is written, it seems like the best of a bad situation. Yes, ideally the native tribes can stay on their land, and everyone could live in peace, but unfortunately, after numerous wars amongst the differing sides, it was damn near impossible. But the native tribes would be receiving financial and material assistance in order to get to their new land safely, as long as the native tribes signed the treaties. On paper, yes, their government was trying to make a fair trade with the Native Americans for their lands. But, as I'm sure many of us can assume, the native tribes did not want to leave the land that generations upon generations of their families have lived on. But with the act being voted through Congress, it allowed Andrew Jackson and those loyal to him free range to bribe and threaten tribes into signing the treaties for their removal. And at the end of his presidency in 1837, he had roughly 70 signed removal treaties that would displace roughly 50,000 Eastern natives to Indian Territory. Real quick, Indian Territory was defined as, quote, "the region belonging to the United States west of the Mississippi River, but excluding the states of Missouri and Iowa, as well as the territory of Arkansas." As stated prior, the Indian Territory that the Five Civilized Tribes were sent to stood in the place of modern-day Oklahoma and Kansas. But the Cherokee Nation didn't comply and actually challenged the Indian Removal Act in court. In 1831, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that, quote, "Indian Territory is admitted to compose a part of the United States," and affirmed that the tribes were domestic dependent nations, and their relation of the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian. On December 29, 1835, U.S. government officials and roughly 300 to 500 members of the Cherokee Nation, none of who were elected officials of the Cherokee Nation, met to discuss a new treaty, this one being named the Treaty of New Ochota. By the end of discussions, the Cherokee Nation had signed over all the lands in their territory for a sum of $5 million, about $179 million today. More than 15,000 Cherokee protested this illegal treaty, but on the 23rd of May, 1836, the Treaty of New Ochota was ratified by the United States Senate, and the Cherokee Nation were forced to Indian Territory. In May 1838, federal troops and state militias started the roundup of Cherokees into stockades. This event would become known as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears in modern terms refers to the forced relocation of the Five Civilized Tribes from their homeland to Indian Territory. Each native tribe had their own experience with the Trail of Tears. For the Cherokee, in May of 1838, troops and militia members began transporting the Cherokee Nation to the stockade, and although they were told to treat them kindly, some did not heed to these orders. According to the National Park Service, quote, "Families were separated, the elderly and ill forced out at gunpoint, people given only moments to collect cherished possessions, white looters followed, ransacking homesteads as the Cherokee were led away." 3 groups left in the summer of 1838, traveling from roughly present-day Chattanooga, Tennessee, by boat, rail, and wagon, while 15,000 captives waited for removal. But the travel proved near impossible. The overland group suffered 3 to 5 deaths a day from illness, and the water route groups could not navigate due to low water levels. The large group of Cherokees still waiting for removal dealt with overcrowding, drought, and poor sanitation. It made these camps miserable. Therefore, the Cherokees made the decision to ask to postpone their removal until a later date, in which they would remove themselves voluntarily. The US government granted this, but only on the condition that they stayed in the internment camps, which resulted in even more and more deaths. According to the National Park Service, quote, "By November, 12 groups of 1,000 each were trudging 800 miles overland to the west. The last party went by water. Now, heavy autumn rains and hundreds of wagons on the muddy route made roads impassable. Little grazing and game could be found to supplement meager rations. 2/3 of the ill-equipped Cherokees were trapped between the icebound Ohio and Mississippi rivers during January. Some drank stagnant water and succumbed to disease. An account from a survivor stated, quote, "Long time we travel on way to new land. People feel bad when they leave old nation. Women's cry and make sad wails. Children cry and many men cry. But they say nothing and just put heads down and keep on go towards west. Many days pass and people die very much." This is just one account of the horrifying journey of the Trail of Tears. By March 1839, the Cherokee Nation was in the west for the most part. No one knows exactly how many died on their journey west. Missionary Dr. Elzer Butler, who accompanied the Cherokees, estimated that over 4,000 died, nearly a fifth of the Cherokee Nation. The total number of deaths is debated, but it seems to be around 3,000 to 6,000 members of the Cherokee Nation died in total as a result of their removal to Indian Territory. After arriving in Indian Territory, the Cherokee Nation soon built a democratic form of government, built churches, schools, and created a newspaper, and even businesses began sprouting up. By September 1839, the final group of Cherokee arrived via the Trail of Tears, and the Cherokee Nation adopted a new constitution. Tahlequah became the new Cherokee capital, and it became a hub for local business. It still remains the tribal headquarters for the Cherokee Nation today. The Cherokee Nation has governed its people in the Indian Territory since 1839 through 6 distinct periods. The first period, from 1839 to 1848, marked the re-establishment of the United Cherokee Nation. After the Supreme Court's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia in 1839, President Andrew Jackson's refusal to comply caused a split with the Cherokee Nation. This led to the Ridge Party, which agreed to the Treaty of New Echota and removal, and the Ross Party, which opposed removal. A civil war ensued among the Cherokee after their migration to Indian Territory, resulting in the loss of Treaty Party leaders, and a fragile peace was established with a treaty in 1846. The next was the era called the Golden Age of the Cherokees, 1849 to 1860, marked by economic and cultural growth. Institutions like the Cherokee Male and Female Seminary emerged, and the tribe revived a newspaper and developed an educational system. Many Cherokees thrived economically, achieving living standards comparable to their non-Indian neighbors. However, this prosperity ended with the American Civil War, which saw the Cherokee divided in loyalty and suffering greatly. The next quote-unquote period was the post-Civil War period. The Cherokee faced challenges to keep their land and tribe intact between 1871 and 1906. Railroads brought intruders who wanted to settle on Cherokee lands, straining the tribe's finances. Despite this, the Cherokee Nation thrived as farmers, herders, and merchants. However, ongoing harassment from outsiders affected their peace. During the Oklahoma Land Run of 1889, the federal government aimed to eliminate the Cherokee outlet, a key revenue source. After President Harrison closed it in 1890, the tribe nearly went bankrupt and eventually caved into congressional actions, leading to their absorption into the state of Oklahoma. In 1893, the Dawes Commission was created to allocate land from the 5 tribes, and Congress passed the Curtis Act of 1898 to speed up this process. The Oklahoma Enabling Act of 1906 allowed for the formation of a single state from Indian and Oklahoma territories. The same year, the Five Tribes Act changed the plan to end tribal powers, instead extending them indefinitely in Oklahoma. Consequently, the Cherokee Nation remained as a governing body. However, the allotment process led to the destruction of the Cherokee land base. The Dawes Commission identified 41,889 citizens of the Cherokee Nation and allotted 4,420,068 acres among them. From 1907 to 1946, the Cherokee faced challenges post-statehood, with many losing land and facing poverty during the Great Depression. After World War II, returning veterans sparked a revival of Cherokee identity and authority, leading to a period of renewal and rebuilding for the Cherokee Nation. Under leaders like Jesse B. Million, the tribe established various initiatives, including gaming operations, and regained the right to elect their leaders. The Cherokee Nation has experienced cultural and economic revival, with an increasing emphasis on self-determination. Today, The Cherokee Nation contributes significantly to the economy of northeastern Oklahoma, teaching language and tribal history, building educational institutions, and restoring traditional lands. The next tribe will be the Muscogee or Creeks. According to Muscogee spatial storytelling, one of the many Muscogee origin stories goes as so. In the Muscogee Creek creation story, the world, Earth, was underwater. When the Creator was to begin to make the Earth, he sought help from the animal spirits. With his claws, the crawfish was able to go to the bottom of the water, grab the mud, go back to the surface, and pile the mud to create the Earth. A large winged bird went over the land with its wings and helped shape the valleys and mountains, while crawfish made the first hill. Creator took Earth from the first piece of land and shaped it into the first forms of people and breathed life into them. These people were Lucky Hunter and Corn Woman. According to the 5civilizedtribes.org, the Muscogee people are descendants of a remarkable culture that, before 1500 AD, spanned all the region known today as the southeastern United States. They built giant pyramids along the rivers of the region, and later built expansive towns within the river valleys of the present-day states of Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and Alabama. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it's almost unbelievable about the complexity of these pyramids, and how they use the sun's positions to determine where and how the pyramids were built. I'll leave a link to a video that dives into the pyramids if you're interested in a deep dive into them. The Muscogee were distinct in that they were not a single tribe, but rather a confederation of multiple tribes. The Muscogee tribal unit centered around what they referred to as mother towns, which were comprised of a central settlement and surrounding villages. A confederacy of towns were formed to incorporate into their alliance with small tribes, such as the Hachiti, the Yuchi, Alabama, among many others. The town government consisted of a principal chief, or Miko, a second Miko, which was sort of like a subordinate in English terms, and a council. The chief was elected for life by the town council. Government centered around the council for the entire nation. Like many native tribes, one person could not make the decision to go to war or remain in peace. It was often decided by a council. The council was made up of headmen from each confederacy town, and it served as a way to unify all these tribes into one people. That being said, each tribe had the freedom to act independently. They could act as they please, but they would have to answer for their actions to the council at the end of the day. I found a great source of information from a presentation done by a man named Turner Hunt. He is an archaeological technician for the Historic and Cultural Preservation Department for the Muscogee Creek Nation. I want to take a second to give him a shout out, because he did an amazing job explaining the history and every aspect of the Muscogee Creek Nation's history, and I used him as a primary source for this. And thank you Hungry History for posting the amazing video. I'll link to it in the show notes. Again, I'm not going to go into each contact point with the Europeans in the Muscogee, as Mr. Hunt does. But first contact between the Muscogee people and Europeans was in 1526, when Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon created a short-lived Spanish colony, somewhere near the coast in present-day Georgia or the Carolinas. Ayllon's expedition made landfall sometime around the 9th of August 1526, but found the ground uninhabitable and moved south and created a small settlement. But after hunger, disease, and hostile native tribes, they quickly left. In 1690, a British trading post was constructed on the Oshis River. Several Muscogee towns moved to the vicinity to be nearby to the English for trading purposes. In 1755, the Yamasee War started. According to the South Carolina Encyclopedia, the war was a major 18th century conflict between the colony of Carolina, i.e. the British, and its trade partners, the Yamasees. In short, the Yamasees were trading deerskins for trade goods, and had quickly depleted their deerskin resource. They soon began to raid into Florida, and began trading kidnapped individuals as slaves. Soon, the Yamasees held massive debts to the British colony, and the British created a board to regulate trade and enforce fair trade practices. With the debt increasing, the board made the decision to require at least 2 years of labor from every adult male Yamasee. With white settlers moving in further and further into their lands, it caused an uprising. Having exhausted their deer and slave supplies, the Yamasees decided to kill their creditors and attack white settlements along Carolina's southern frontier. The Muscogee people were strong allies of the Yamasee and fought alongside them along with the Choctaws. The Cherokee fought alongside the British. The Creeks, Yamasee, and their allies dealt brutal blows to their enemies. With the white settlers of the colony escaping to Charlestown for safety, they regrouped and utilized all white males and even armed their black slaves and made for an attack. At the battles of Port Royal and Salkehatchie, the Yamasees were defeated, though their allies still remained a powerful force. But when the Carolinians managed to convince the lower Cherokees to side with them against the Creeks, they launched a deadly attack that would put the worst of the war behind them in 1716. According to the National Park Service, after the war, the Muscogee towns withdrew to the Chattahoochee River, and the Uchis moved with them. They were known as Lower Creeks. The Upper Creeks were centered on the Coosa and Tallapoosa rivers to the northeast. To put it in easier terms, the Lower Creeks were in southwestern Georgia, and the Upper Creeks were in northeastern Alabama. After the Revolutionary War, a new mass migration was taking place, but this time, it was the Americans. Cotton had become one of the most profitable crops of the time, and with the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, American settlers moved south, seeking claims of the rich soil in these river bottom regions. The Muscogee had always been great farmers and adapted quickly to the new market of cotton-based economy. But American settlers wanted their land, and the American government was desperate for the money the cotton could provide their new government after a long war. Pressure from these settlers pushed for the federal government to remove all Native Americans east of the Mississippi River to the west, and allowed these lands to be taken over by the American people. But the Muscogee people held a council, and they passed a law providing the death penalty for anyone who ceded land without the council's authority. The Muscogee people were divided over the issue of removal. Chief William McIntosh was one of the chiefs that wanted to remain loyal to the United States, seeing it as the only way to avoid complete annihilation by the United States, as others just wanted to go back to their way of life before the settlers moved in. Eventually, this led to a civil war between the Muscogee people. The Creek Indian War started in 1813 between the United States and loyal Muscogee, led by General Andrew Jackson, and the Muscogee people who had turned militant and preferred their traditional way of life, who were called Red Sticks, for they carried a red club into battle. By 1814, the Red Sticks had lost, and the Treaty of Fort Jackson was signed that ceded 23 million acres of Muscogee land to the United States, quote, to cover the cost of war. In 1825, the Treaty of Indian Springs was signed by Chief William McIntosh that ceded all Lower Creek land to the United States for the state of Georgia, and in return, the Muscogee would get lands in Indian Territory. But if you'll remember, the Muscogee Council had passed a law that if someone ceded the land without the council's permission, it was a death sentence. McIntosh and several other leaders were assassinated by their own people for their involvement in the Treaty of Indian Springs. But there were still a large number of Muscogee people living in the region until 1836, when 2,500 people were forced to march on foot to Alabama. This was the beginning of the Muscogee Trail of Tears. According to the National Park Service, over 14,000 Muscogee Indians made the 3-month journey to Oklahoma, a trip of over 800 land miles and another 400 by water. Most left with only what they could carry. In total, the U.S. Army enforced the removal of 20,000 Muscogees from the southeast region of the modern-day United States. Roughly 8,000 died on the journey. 20 years after removal, the Muscogee population was only 13,537. Though the Muscogee Nation was beaten down, their spirit was not broken, and the people carved out a new life in the Indian Territory, in which the Creeks essentially had their central strip east to west of modern-day Oklahoma. Map will be linked in the show notes. But the Upper Creeks relocated on the Arkansas and Veracruz rivers in eastern central modern-day Oklahoma, and the Lower Creeks relocated to the Canadian River and its branches in western central modern-day Oklahoma. The Muscogee Nation stuck to their traditional ways and built tribal towns, and both the Upper and Lower Creeks continued to send representatives to a national council that met near High Springs in central Oklahoma. Then, the United States went to war with itself. According to the 5Civilized Tribes.org, The first 3 battles of the war in Indian Territory occurred when Confederate forces attacked a large number of neutral Muscogee, led by Abdi Yehola. But in whole, there were a large number of Creek Indians that fought for both the Confederacy and the Union. The Reconstruction Treaty of 1866 required the cession of 3.2 million acres, which was almost half of the Creek Nation. But again, the Creek kept fighting, and by 1867, the Creek Nation had adopted a written constitution, had a principal and second chief, a judicial branch, and a bicameral legislature composed of a House of Kings and a House of Warriors. Also in 1867, a new capital was established on the Deep Fork of the Canadian, at Ocmulgee. In 1878, the Creek constructed a familiar native stone council house, which still remains at the center of the city of Ocmulgee. According to the Five Civilized Tribes website, in the late 1800s, the Dawes Commission began negotiating with the Muscogee Nation for the allotment of the national domain. Enter Chito Harjo, born in 1846 in Arbeca, on the Deep Fork River in Indian Territory. According to Oklahoma history, Arbeca's traditional function was to guard the Creek people, and it was known as the Gate of the Muscogee. Prior to removal, Arbeca warriors were expected to warn other Creek towns of approaching danger. Therefore, in 1898, when the United States Congress passed the Curtis Act, which essentially made to dismantle native government and gave full control of affairs to the United States Congress, Harjo fulfilled his role as gatekeeper and fought for his own people. Harjo and his followers, called Crazy Snakes, opposed the allotment of Creek land and fought for their right to govern themselves. He even went to Washington, D.C. to talk with President Theodore Roosevelt about this legislation. In 1907, the Indian lands of the Five Civilized Tribes became the new state of Oklahoma, and in 1930, the Indian Reorganization Act granted the right of the Indian tribes to adopt a new constitution subject to the approval of the Secretary of the Interior. In 1979, a new constitution was adopted by the Muscogee people, and it recognized Muscogee communities that serve as local government units within the national system. According to the National Park Service, the Muscogee Nation is the 4th largest federally recognized tribe in the United States. Like the United States government, the Muscogee government is composed of executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Although the world around them has changed drastically, the Muscogee people still hold tight to their traditional ways. Family ties are strong, as values and beliefs continue to be passed down from generation to generation. Tribal towns and ceremonial grounds still exist. The Muscogee people still hold sacred ceremonies, like the green corn ceremony that is a ritual that dates to pre-removal. Life in the Muscogee Nation in many ways is no different from anywhere else in the United States. Children go to school, individuals go to different churches and have different beliefs, but one common heritage binds these people together. Quote, "It is this heritage, this special culture, that makes the Muscogee Nation what it is today." The next tribe will be the Spartans of the lower Mississippi Valley, the Chickasaw. According to the Chickasaw TV, the migration story of the Chickasaw and the Choctaw goes as so. The ancestors were very spiritual people, and they felt like they couldn't do anything praying to the Creator, so they prayed and asked for direction on what they should do, and they felt like they got the answer in the form of a sacred pole. The directions to use the pole was to put the pole on the ground each evening, and in the morning when they woke up, whichever direction it was leaning, that would be the way that they would travel for the day. Each morning they woke up, it was leaning towards the east. Therefore, they followed the pole, all the way until they came to this large body of flowing water. Today, we would know this body as the Mississippi River. But they put the pole on the ground, and they felt like the pole was still leaning towards the east. So they made rafts for everyone, jumped on them, and floated across the river. Then once they got to the other side of the river, major things began to happen. There were 2 brothers leading these large groups. One brother, Choctaw, and the other was named Chickasaw. When they put the pole on the ground in the evening, the next morning they woke up and there was a huge discussion. Choctaw said the pole was standing straight up, and this was their new homeland. But Chickasaw said that the pole was still leaning to the east, and we must travel to the east until we find our true homeland. They talked about all throughout the day. Finally, at the end of the day, there was a huge argument. Choctaw says that everyone who believes the pole is standing straight up, stay here and we will call this our new homeland. Choctaw were the Choctaw people. Chickasaw says everyone who believes that the pole is leaning to the east, go with me until we find our new homeland. So Chickasaw and his group left. When Chickasaw and his group left, we can think of this as the beginning of the Chickasaw history, culture, and language. As they traveled to the southeast, they finally found their true homeland. Skilled warriors and traders, the Chickasaw descended from ancient mound-building societies during the Mississippian and woodland periods. The Chickasaw constructed earthen-worked sacred places that served as their communities. They settled in thickly wooded areas of the modern-day states of southwestern Kentucky, northern Mississippi, northwestern Alabama, and western Tennessee. According to the National Park Service, Chickasaw territory centered on their old fields near present-day Tupelo, Mississippi, but they controlled a huge region bounded by the Ohio, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Tombigbee rivers. The Chickasaws were a matrilineal society divided into clans and ruled by the, quote, High Minko, known to the Europeans as the King of the Chickasaws. A matrilineal society is a group that adheres to a kinship system of the maternal lines instead of the paternal lines. So in plain English, instead of the father's bloodline, it's the mother's bloodline. In his book Splendid Land, Splendid People, author James Atkinson talks about the era of the Chickasaw history post-Battle of Acquia until their removal in 1830. He talks about how the country of the Chickasaws lay at a central point in the Mississippi River system. Two major rivers played a huge role for the Chickasaws. The Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers funneled into Chickasaw lands and were the main hubs for travel and trade for the southeastern Indians. Edmund Atkin wrote in 1755, quote, It is not possible to cast an eye ever so lightly over a map without being struck with the importance of the Chickasaw situation. What struck Atkin the most was that from their towns, quote, the Chickasaws could command all the water passages between New Orleans and Canada. But it wasn't only the waterways that the Chickasaws controlled. There were also two major overland trading routes that passed through their territory. The East-West Creek Path, later named the Path to Carolina, and the North-South Natchez Path. This gave them essentially the perfect position for trade routes, where even faraway tribes would pass through their territory for trade. But with this precious land came competition from a number of other native tribes. Though the Chickasaws were a fairly small tribe, with only about 6,000 members at the time, and with the surrounding tribes having much more, these are rough estimates, but the Illinois had 12,000, Choctaws had 21,000, the Cherokees had 16,000, and the Upper Creeks had 9,000. And with European arrival, the Chickasaws were at risk of losing their land. Therefore, the Chickasaw Nation put a great emphasis on military prowess, and they would prove that their nickname was theirs for a reason. First contact occurred in December of 1540, when DeSoto and his men arrived in the homeland of the Chickasaws. It is believed that DeSoto camped near the present-day town of Starkville, Mississippi. The Chickasaw chief presented DeSoto with deerskins and supplies. But when DeSoto demanded 200 people, who he could enslave for the remainder of their journey, it soured relations. In the early morning hours of the 4th of March, 1541, the Chickasaw launched a surprise attack against DeSoto and his men, and forced them out of the region. DeSoto lost many supplies, livestock, weapons, and food. It would be more than 150 years before Europeans would enter this land again. The early 1700s would see Chickasaw warriors fighting alongside European forces, mainly the British. For example, at the Battle of Acquia in 1736, the Chickasaws fought with the British to defeat the French and the Choctaw. The Chickasaws had major victories over powerful French and Indian armies in 1736, 1739, and 1752, with the help of their British ally. In 1759, French traveler Jean Bernard Bosset stated that, quote, all the northern and southern tribes, as well as the French, have waged war against the Chickasaws without being able to drive them from their lands. I think Wendy St. Jean put it best in the American Indian Quarterly, stating, quote, to this day, it is virtually impossible to find tribal history or even an encyclopedia entry on the Chickasaws that does not describe them as unconquerable. After the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763, in which the British and Chickasaw defeated the French and their allies, the Chickasaws lived in relative peace. But in 1776, the American Revolution started, and though the Chickasaw felt most committed to the British because they were longtime allies, they stayed neutral during the war. Until 1779, when the Chickasaws received a written threat from the new state of Virginia, telling them to stay neutral or risk being invaded. But the Chickasaw chiefs were having none of it, and responded in a letter. It's a long quote, but a golden one. Quote, "We desire no other friendship of you, but only desire you will inform us when you are coming, and we will save you the trouble of coming quite here, for we will meet you halfway, for we have heard so much of it that it makes our heads ache. Take care that we don't serve you as we have served the French before with all their Indians, and send you back without your heads. We are a nation that fears or values no nation as long as our great father King George stands by us, for you may depend as long as life lasts with us, we will hold him fast by the hand." The only battle that took place between the Chickasaw and the Americans was a small skirmish when the Chickasaws attacked George Roger Clark's Fort Jefferson in western Kentucky. Once the war was over and the Americans had defeated the British, the Chickasaws quickly established relations with the United States. In 1795, the United States signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo, and all the lands above the 31st parallel became the United States. Therefore, all the Chickasaw lands fell within the boundaries of the United States. In 1798, Mississippi Territory was created by the U.S. Congress. It was a strip of land extending roughly 100 miles north-south from the Mississippi River to the Chattahoochee on the Georgia border. It increased in size in 1804 and 1812. 1804 saw the northern boundary extend to the Tennessee state line. In 1812, President James Madison annexed additional land along the Gulf of Mexico coast. By 1813, the Mississippi Territory encompassed present-day Alabama and Mississippi. And on the 1st of March, 1817, the eastern section of the Mississippi Territory was turned into the state of Alabama, and the western section remained Mississippi, and both were established as states. Since 1798, American settlers had been flooding into the Mississippi Territory along the Natchez Trace that went straight through Chickasaw lands. With the growing pressure for the Chickasaw to cede their lands to the United States, Chickasaw chiefs pushed for the production of renewable resources, such as cotton farming and cattle ranching, and the Chickasaw moved away from the deerskin trade. According to Greg O. Bryan, in the Chickasaws, the Unconquerable People, quote, "Along with these new agricultural pursuits came slave ownership, constitutional government, private land ownership, and changing ideas about the role of women that more closely mirrored American mainstream values." If you remember, the Chickasaw, like the Cherokee, held high value for the women of the tribe. But even with these changes, the Chickasaws could not stop the tidal wave that was the United States. Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Jackson and his delegates met with the Chickasaw representatives in Franklin, Tennessee, and a treaty was signed on the 30th of August, 1830. The Chickasaws agreed to cede their lands east of the Mississippi River in exchange for an equal amount of land in the west. However, the treaty fell through when suitable land could not be found. In 1832, new negotiations took place in Chickasaw territory at Pontotoc Creek. On the 20th of October, 1832, a new treaty was signed. The Chickasaw lands were then surveyed and sold, with each adult Chickasaw receiving a temporary allotment that would be sold and all the money placed in a fund to cover the cost of removal. American settlers immediately began to move in, even though the treaty promised that the U.S. government would prevent new settlement until the new lands of the Chickasaw were found. According to Mr. Bryan, new lands were not found for the Chickasaws in the West until January of 1837, when the Chickasaws and Choctaws met at Dokesville, Choctaw Nation in Indian Territory, and the Choctaws sold the western part of their new territory to the Chickasaws. Although this agreement between the two tribes was not a treaty with the United States, President Jackson submitted it to the Senate and it was approved in February of 1837. The Chickasaws and Choctaws made two additional agreements in 1854 and 1855, on the exact extent of their territory and rights. The Chickasaws were one of the last tribes to be removed, but Chickasaw families faced hardships and death while traveling hundreds of miles through the blistering heat and freezing cold. That being said, according to the website Chickasaw.net, quote, Chickasaw suffered less than other tribes because we controlled our departures and chose favorable seasons to travel. This undoubtedly saved many lives that otherwise could have been lost. Chickasaw families continued to arrive in Indian Territory up until the 1890s. The Chickasaw Nation established its own constitution in 1856 during gatherings at Good Spring, Oklahoma. Throughout the days of Indian Territory, Chickasaws had strong leadership from elected judges, senators, and legislators. Governors led the Chickasaw Nation through the Civil War and the post-war Reconstruction. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Governor Cyrus Harris approved Chickasaw secession from the Union on May 25, 1861, and the Chickasaws joined the Confederacy. According to the Chickasaw TV, most of the military activity occurred north of the Chickasaw Territory. They mainly held a defensive position within Chickasaw territories. The first Choctaw and Chickasaw mounted rifles were formed on the 31st of July, 1861, and were placed under the command of Colonel Douglas H. Cooper, who was the former Choctaw-Chickasaw Indian agent for the U.S. government. They were responsible for all the items they took into battle, their weapons, clothes, and anything else they brought with them. Following the Union's victory, the Chickasaw and Choctaw tribes were forced by treaty to relinquish a huge portion of their lands known as the Lease District. As talked about prior, in 1898 the Curtis Act was signed into law that took power from the tribal government and gave it to the United States Congress. At the Sequoia Convention in Muscogee, in August of 1905, the Chickasaw joined the other 4 civilized tribes, and delegates adopted a new constitution and planned a new Indian state. But the United States rejected their petition, and Oklahoma became the 46th state of the United States in 1907. According to Oklahoma history, quote, although the Chickasaw Nation ceased to exist from 1907 to 1983, the office of the governor continued through presidential appointment. New Deal legislation of the 1930s, World War II, and the post-war period brought changes to the lives of the Chickasaw, including funds for education, relief, jobs, election of tribal councils, and a renewed sense of Indian identity. The Chickasaw Nation fought in all branches of World War II, and fought bravely. Just one example, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Harvey received the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal in the United States Armies for his actions in combat. But he was not quite done. In July 1950, he was the captain of the 17th Infantry Regiment, 7th Division, and played a part of the amphibious landing at Incheon, Korea during the Korean War. According to the Chickasaw Hall of Fame, Harvey took command of Company C of the regiment when the company commander was wounded in action. Company C became the lead attack unit on Hill 1232. After his company became pinned down, Captain Harvey moved forward to wipe out multiple enemy machine gun crews. Though he took a bullet to the chest, he did not stop. He sighted the next enemy in their machine nest and took the crew out with a single grenade. He refused medical treatment until he was certain his company had complete control of the hill. In 1951, Captain Harvey was awarded the military's highest and most prestigious award, the Medal of Honor. In 1979, a draft of a new constitution was developed, and in the 4 years that followed, tribal officials worked endlessly to formulate a constitution to fit the needs of the modern Chickasaw society, and in 1983, the ratification of the official tribal constitution was complete. In 1987, Governor Bill Anotobe was elected and the Chickasaw Nation entered the 21st century as a successful economic and political entity. According to Chickasaw.net, since the 1980s, tribal government has focused most of its efforts on building an economically diverse base to generate funds that will support programs and services to the Chickasaw people, other First Americans, and their communities. Today, the Chickasaw Nation is economically strong, culturally vibrant, and full of energetic people still dedicated to the preservation of family, community, and heritage. The Choctaw Nation traces its ancestry to Mississippi and some sections of Alabama. Legends tell that they originated from Naniwaya, a sacred hill near modern-day Noxapater, Mississippi. Naniwaya is often referred to as, quote, the Mother Mound. The Choctaw have called the region of southeastern United States home for centuries. They were fierce warriors, skilled traders, and farmers. The Choctaws were not nomadic, which allowed them to become great farmers. This gave them the ability to grow excess corn and other crops that they could then trade with other native tribes. If you listened to the last episode, you heard the migration story of the Chickasaw and Choctaw. If you haven't, please go give episode 1 a listen. And also like the Chickasaw, the Choctaw put high value on women, as they were the head of the household. According to the Five Civilized Tribes website, the early political organization of the Choctaw tribe is best described as a loose confederation of 3 political districts. Again, I'm going to try my best to pronounce these. The Mashalutabi in the northeast, Pushmataha in the southwest, and the Apakshanabi in the southeast. Each had a district chief that attained his position through demonstrated leadership potential, though sometimes family inheritance had been a deciding factor, and they would usually hire 1 to 2 assistant chiefs. Each town had its own village chief that oversaw the village, an assistant chief that would organize dances and festivals, and a war chief that acted as a leader of the town's warriors. Each town had their own councils that would meet to discuss important matters. However, the district chief held power, and most of the time his decision would be the final one. Sports played a huge role in Choctaw culture, most importantly, stickball. It was often used as a way to settle rivalries or disputes between families within the tribes or even different tribes, but most often, it was seen as a way to create friendly competition amongst the different clans and tribes. What is stickball? Glad you asked. According to the Choctaw Nation website, the traditional game had very few rules. Play took place on a natural field, with players wearing no padded clothing or shoes and wielding 2 kapukas or stickball sticks. The sticks were made of hickory or other hardwoods, cut from the trunk or made of saplings. The ends were thinned and bent into flared cups, with leather lacing inside to hold the ball, or towa, which was made of woven strips of leather. Think of the sticks as like miniature primitive lacrosse sticks. A goalpost was set at each end of the field, and teams scored by hitting the post with the ball. Full contact games with limitless players could last for days until either a certain score or time limit was reached. According to American anthropologist James Mooney, quote, almost everything short of murder is allowable. The first mention of the Choctaw name in modern history was recorded in 1675 by a Spanish priest in Florida, where he warned settlers against traveling too far to the west unless they wanted to meet the fearsome Choctaw. If you'll remember from the migration story, the Choctaw were referred to as the Brother Choctaw. According to the Mississippi Choctaw website, the first sustained European contact was from French explorer D.I. Berville in 1699. This would lead to the 2 sides becoming longtime allies and fighting alongside each other for the next 65 years. Most of the major battles we discussed in the previous episode. If you remember, the Choctaws sided with the French, so I won't repeat them here, but not all Choctaws wanted to only ally and most importantly trade with just France. Choctaw war leader, Red Shoes, from the Western Division of the Choctaw Nation, opened trade with British fur traders, and when Red Shoes killed some French traders, it started the Choctaw Civil War in 1747, between the Western and Eastern divisions of Choctaw. The Eastern Division allied with France and defeated and burned several Western Division towns. Hundreds died during the war, and it created deep divisions within the nation. But leaders worked hard to end the inter-tribe rivalry and unite their people. Although some Choctaw towns and individuals continued to seek trade relationships with Britain, this action was actually encouraged under the non-cohesive leadership traditions of the Choctaws, and peace slowly came to the Choctaw Nation. In fact, the Choctaws played their 2 European allies against one another, and strengthened their hand in the foreign diplomacy by trading deerskins and the other items for manufactured goods, mainly guns and wool cloth with fur traders from both countries. The Eastern Division remained stronger allies with the French, however, and fought alongside them in numerous battles, mainly against the British and the Chickasaw Nation, as we talked about in the previous episode. They would remain strong allies until 1763, when the 7 Years' War came to an end, and the French were essentially kicked out of North America, besides some fishing rights in the Newfoundland region and some other small islands. The Choctaw soon signed treaties with the British and became allies, and even fought on the British side during the American Revolutionary War. After the American Revolution, the Choctaws were forced to seek new alliances with the United States and Spain, which after the war gained control of the entire Gulf Coast. In 1784, the Choctaws signed the Treaty of Mobile with Spain that opened trading, and the Spanish believed they held a monopoly on the trade market of the Southwest. But just 2 years later in 1786, the United States signed their first treaty with the Choctaw Nation. According to Choctaw Nation, the Treaty of Hopewell was signed in 1786. I think this is a good time to show the meaningful actions of the Choctaw during these discussions. It's a longer quote, but I think it shows the importance of tradition and how these talks sort of went. Quote, "When the sun was at the highest point of the day, the Choctaw participants began the Eagle Tail Dance. The Choctaw dancers painted their bodies in white clay and carried with them white poles with white deer hides. After a period of singing and dancing, they set up the largest of the white poles during the ceremony and gave gifts, including a calumet pipe, to the American commissioners. They then laid down coals brought from their village of West Yazoo and laid them in the American fire. Coals from the American fire were then brought back to West Yazoo to be mixed in the community's fire. The Eagle Tail Dance and the mixing of coals was the highest honor the Choctaw could give." Talks ended with the United States and Choctaw defining borders for the Choctaw Nation, alliance of trading, and the plans to build 3 trading posts within Choctaw Nation. In the late 1790s, Spain transferred claims on Choctaw lands to the United States, and this left the United States as a sole trading partner of the Choctaw, and this is when things started to move towards removal. Deer herds had become depleted, the demand for deer skins had dropped, and with the United States officials pushing assimilation, many within Choctaw Nation moved on from a fur trading economy. They started to move towards raising and selling horses and livestock, cultivating cotton with African American slave labor, marketing food products, among many other things. According to the Encyclopedia of Alabama, despite their success at assimilating into American society, the Choctaws repeatedly were forced to fend off state and federal officials that demanded their lands. But 1801 started a string of treaties that ceded land to the United States. I'm going to go through these quickly. Fort Adams Treaty of 1801 that ceded over 2.6 million acres. Treaty of Fort Confederation of 1802 that ceded 10,000 acres. Treaty of Hoboken-Tupa of 1803 that ceded over 853,000 acres. And Treaty of Mount Dexter of 1805 that ceded over 4.4 million acres. Within a span of 5 years, the Choctaw had ceded most of their land to the United States. Even with the Choctaws ceding land to the United States, the Choctaws fought alongside the United States in the Creek War of 1813-1814. Choctaws under the leadership of Chief Pushmataha allied with American forces under Andrew Jackson to end the Red Stick Creek Rebellion. But again, there was division amongst the Choctaws, as some sided on the side of the Red Sticks. According to the Encyclopedia of Alabama, quote, "A few hundred Choctaws from the 6th Towns Division supported the aims of the Red Stick Creeks, and moved to southeast Alabama to escape retaliation from the Americans and Pushmataha." Fighting alongside the United States in war could not stop the land cessions from coming in the future. The Fort Stevens Treaty of 1816 ceded another 10,000 acres of land to the United States in exchange for $6,000, roughly $134,000 today. 1820 saw the Treaty of Dokestan, which ceded over 5 million acres of Choctaw land in exchange for 13 million acres in the Canadian, Arkansas, Red River, and Kiamichi watersheds. This may sound like a good deal, giving up 5 million acres for 13 million, but they were quickly being moved from their homeland, the land that had housed the Choctaw Nation and their families for thousands of years. Then in 1825, the Treaty of Washington City was signed that exchanged land in Arkansas for land in Oklahoma. This land they had already ceded in the previous treaty, so it was essentially just being exchanged for land in Oklahoma, i.e., Indian Territory. But the Choctaws in the meantime of these treaties were moving closer and closer to full assimilation to American society. Beginning in 1819, the Choctaw leaders welcomed missionaries from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions into their nation to teach basic math, English, modern farming techniques, and other business-related skills. By 1826, with the help from these missionaries, the Choctaw Nation had established a written constitution. This constitution had a representative form of government, with 3 elected chiefs, 1 from each division, a formal education system, and a police force. But it seemed like no matter what the Choctaw did, it was never good enough, and things moved towards removal. As with other tribes, the Choctaw don't use the term Trail of Tears, but instead refer to it as removals. They were also the first native nation to be removed to Indian Territory. But Choctaw leadership understood the power and threat the United States had, and if willing, could use on the Choctaw people. Therefore, during the War of 1812, the Choctaw warriors fought side by side with Andrew Jackson and the United States, and they signed treaties that promised a lasting friendship. But as stated before, in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed by President Andrew Jackson. I do a full breakdown in the last episode, but just a reminder, that gave power to the president to grant land west of the Mississippi River in exchange for the Native American homelands. It also gave the native nations financial and material assistance in their travels to their new homelands. The latter was not followed strictly. Now the Choctaw were different, because their removal began for some in the late 1790s, and had been happening all the way up to 1830. Whenever the Choctaw ceded land with all the prior treaties discussed, there was technically a removal. But the Indian Removal Act was a final blow to the Choctaw Nation that finally moved them out of their homelands entirely. On the 27th of September, 1830, the Choctaw government signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, which ceded all Choctaw lands in modern-day Alabama along the Mississippi River for 15 million acres in Indian Territory. Also, according to Article 14 of the treaty, each head of the family would have the ability to become a United States citizen and, quote, be entitled to a reservation of one section of 640 acres of land, to be bounded by sectional lines of a survey. In like manner shall be entitled to one half that quantity for each unmarried child which is living with him over 10 years of age, and a quarter section to such child as may be under 10 years of age, to adjoin the location of the parent. The first removals took place from 1831 to 1833 and were some of the darkest days in the history of the Choctaw people. According to the Choctaw Nation website, over a quarter of the Choctaw people removed during those years passed away from the harshest winters in recorded history. They died from disease, exposure, neglect from the United States government, and even homicide. Ryan Spreen, who is the Director of Geographic Information Systems for the Historic Preservation Department of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, states that, quote, someone was sent to check on the corruption and found the embezzlement to be so severe that it was covered up. Most of the Choctaw people who perished on this journey were elders and the young youth. But not all of Choctaw Nation went to Indian Territory. A few thousand remained in Mississippi and Alabama, and their descendants still remain today. These descendants belong to a present-day Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and the MOWA Band of Choctaw Indians. According to the Encyclopedia of Alabama, the MOWA Choctaws claim to be descended from these 6 towns Choctaw, who joined the Red Stick Creeks during the Creek War, and hid in the swamps and forests of southwest Alabama to avoid attacks from the Americans and fellow Choctaws. Once in Indian Territory, the 12,000 tribal members who survived the removal had the task of establishing new communities and a new government. But they adjusted quickly to their new environment, and with the help of missionaries, the Choctaw formed a new government. According to the Five Civilized Tribes website, they kept the name of the 3 districts, Muscogee, Pushmata, and Apukshnubi, and in 1834, a second constitution was adopted, where all lawmaking authority was given to a general council of 27 members, 9 from each district that were all elected. Although the 3 district chiefs were given ex officio status, and that any 2 of them could veto a law that was passed by this elected council, a veto could be overridden by a 2/3 majority vote from the council. Several changes were made to this government through the years, with the first coming in 1843, when they added a House of Representatives and renaming the council the Senate. But it didn't work well, because of the very slow-moving lawmaking process, because of the need of 2 House approval on every single tribal law. In 1860, a new constitution was written up which followed more of the United States platform, with 3 branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, with a principal chief being elected by eligible voters of the tribe, essentially a president. Finally, in 1906, quote, the final disposition of the affairs of the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory, and for other purposes was brought in via the Act of April 26, 1906. Even today, the Choctaws are governed by the provisions of this act. It essentially held the same government, but that the principal chief would hold office until the removal from disability, death, or removal by the President of the United States. It wouldn't be until 1970 that the principal chief position would change to a similar structure as that of the United States, where there would be a popular vote and the term was 4 years long. Today, there is no principal chief. It is now just called the chief position. Going back in time a bit, the Choctaw public school system started in 1821, which was before removal to Indian Territory. Upon arrival in Indian Territory, they began to start up quickly. According to the Five Civilized Tribes website, the Wheelock Academy was founded in 1831. It was one of the prominent of the Choctaw schools and was established in 1843 and became known as the Armstrong Academy. It was located north of the present-day town of Bachito in Bryan County. Then in 1894, the Calvin Institute was established and by 1899 had an enrollment of 300 people, and shortly after Oklahoma was established as a state, it became Oklahoma Presbyterian College. The support comes from the Choctaw tribe, the federal government, and several denominational missionary boards. Unfortunately, the school closed its doors in the late 1960s. Today, the Choctaw Nation is the third largest federally recognized tribe in the United States. They are thriving because of the perseverance and resilience of their ancestors. And the Choctaw Nation's reservation covers nearly 11,000 square miles in southeastern Oklahoma, according to the Choctaw Nation website. In 2018, the Choctaw Nation's economic impact in Oklahoma was over $2.75 billion. The Choctaw people total over 225,000 tribal members. The Choctaw Nation's vision is, quote, living out the Choctaw spirit of faith, family, and culture. Last thing on the Choctaw. You cannot talk about the Choctaw without talking about the Code Talkers. In World War I, the Germans were able to tap into the phone lines of the Americans and learn the locations of where Allied forces were, as well as where supplies were kept. Therefore, the United States put 19 young Choctaw soldiers on the phone and told to talk in their native tongue. This confused the Germans, as they could not decipher the words being spoken, and it helped in the Allies winning the war. These code talkers were also used in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The United States Army Choctaw Code Talkers were inducted in the Oklahoma Military Hall of Fame in 2012. Lastly, we have the Seminoles. The Seminole tribe is a unique tribe because it is a combination of several tribes into one tribe, the Seminoles. According to Florida State University, their ancestry largely traces back to the ancient indigenous peoples of Florida, the Calusas, Tequesta, A's, Appalachee, among others. Then in the 1700s, conflicts with Europeans and fellow tribe members caused a group of Lower Creeks to migrate to Florida from Georgia and Alabama. They were in search of new lands that were rich in soil for their crops and just a peaceful life. Also, this population of native tribes was increased by runaway slaves who sought refuge with them. In the mid-1770s, this congregation of people became known as the Seminole, a name meaning wild people or runaway. According to the Seminole tribe of Florida, the history of the Seminole begins with the first people of Florida that came to the region more than 14,000 years ago. The earliest known sites of the Seminole are located in the Florida Panhandle, and they migrated throughout Florida. When the Ice Age came to an end, it caused a gradual rise of sea levels, and this forced their ancestors inland, flooding the older sites. This is when the Seminole tribe switched from a nomadic lifestyle to permanent settlements that relied on fishing, hunting, and agriculture. Earthwork mounds were formed at community sites that made possible the development of larger communities centered around these mounds. With the rise of these types of permanent communities, the landscape of Florida came into its own. Trade routes were established along with travel and migration routes. However, conflict continued, but by the time of European contact at the beginning of the 16th century, there were distinct cultural regions throughout Florida. First contact was with the Spanish around the year 1500. They are the ones who gave them the word for runaway or wild ones. According to the Seminole Tribe of Florida website, Spanish ships were spotted off the coast. The goal of the Spanish was to add Florida to their expanding empire, and they established trade with the Seminole tribe. And soon the Europeans joined in on the trading. But with the introduction of Spanish and European trading, brought with it diseases that the native tribes have never dealt with: smallpox, measles, yellow fever, and malaria, It is estimated that between 1500 and 1700, these new diseases killed over 90% of the population, not just in Florida, but across the American continents. This is around the time when the Lower Creek began moving south. With native populations decreasing from disease, it left land for the Creeks to move in and join their new tribe. And the Spanish played a key role in this migration and encouraged them to migrate south. The reason being is it created a buffer between Florida and the new British colony of Georgia that was established in 1732. Around the turn of the century, the buffer zone had gone away as encounters with white settlers were becoming more regular. As you have heard throughout this series, white settlers wanted more and more land, and when they began seeing runaway slaves in this land, they soon wanted their former slaves back. In 1817, these conflicts soon escalated into the first of three major wars with the United States. In 1817, General Andrew Jackson led his forces into southern Georgia and Florida that was controlled by the Spanish at the time. And after attacking several key positions, Jackson succeeded in pushing the Seminole tribe further south into Florida. After several United States military expeditions into the Florida Territory, the Spanish formally ceded Florida to the United States in 1821. After the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed, the U.S. government attempted to relocate the Seminole tribe to Oklahoma, which resulted in the Second Seminole War. A small number of Seminoles signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing in May of 1832 that required the Seminoles to give up their lands within 3 years and move west. In 1835, when the U.S. Army arrived, the Seminoles were ready for war. As Major Francis Dade marched from Fort Rook toward Fort Keene with his American force, 180 Seminole warriors led by Alligator, Jumper, and Micanopy attacked. Only one man of that army detachment survived the ambush. The Seminoles' guerrilla warfare proved too much for the U.S. Army, even when they outnumbered their opponent more than 10 to 1. The less than 3,000 warriors led by Alligator, Jumper, Micanopy, and Osceola defeated 4 U.S. generals and more than 30,000 American troops. According to the Florida Department of State, the Second Seminole War, known as the Seminole War proper, was the fiercest war waged by the U.S. government against American Indians. The United States spent more than $20 million, roughly $717 million today, and left more than 1,500 soldiers and unaccounted American civilians dead. In 1842, the end of hostilities came, but no peace treaty was ever signed. By this time, most of the Seminole tribe had moved to Oklahoma. In 1855, the third and final Seminole War broke out, mainly over land. The Seminole population had been reduced to about 200 people, and the fights broke out between them and white settlers in the area. The Third Seminole War ended in 1858, though there were still Seminoles hiding in the backcountry of Florida to evade capture. We will talk more about them later on. According to the National Museum of the American Indian, the United States forcibly removed about 4,400 individuals from the Seminole Nation to Indian Territory. Most Seminoles refused to leave voluntarily, and the United States military invaded to force removal, i.e. the Seminole Wars. Thousands of Seminoles surrendered or were captured or killed during the fighting. After their relocation to Indian Territory, the Seminole of Oklahoma were initially confined to the Creek Nation. According to Oklahoma history, the United States allowed the Seminole to have some self-governance, but only if it adhered to the general laws of the Creek. This led to frustrations with the terms and conditions, and 2 prominent bands of the Seminole, one under Wildcat and the other under John Horse, left Oklahoma and migrated to Mexico in 1849. During the American Civil War of 1861-1865, most of the Seminole Nation sided with the Confederacy. In 1898, the Curtis Act was established, which wanted to take away all power of tribal government in the Indian Territory and give it to the United States Congress. The Dawes Commission dissolved the Seminole government and divided Seminole Nation among roughly 3,000 enrolled tribe members. Although, through sale of these lands, often by fraudulent means, most of the Seminole families and individuals lost their land, and by 1920, only 20% of the Seminole Nation was in Seminole hands. But some Seminoles who had retained their lands became incredibly wealthy with the discovery of the Greater Seminole oil field in 1923. In 1934, the policy of allotment was repealed by Congress, and the following year saw the Seminole re-establishing their government. Now remember how I said that there were still Seminole in Florida, and that they had evaded capture by hiding in the swamps of the backcountry? Well, according to Florida State University, the Seminoles of Florida lived in 5 clusters of communities that surrounded Lake Okeechobee, as well as just south. Each community consisted of family camps that were a few miles or more from one another. Their names were Big Cypress, Cow Creek, Fish Eating Creek, Catfish Lake, and Miami River. In the early 20th century, as American newcomers settled along the coast and moved inland to South Florida, the Seminoles relied on their neighbors for access to the marketplace and for employment. They frequently worked as agricultural laborers, cattle hands, and in tourism. And in the late 1950s, a push among Indian tribes to organize themselves and draft their own charter began, and on the 21st of July, 1957, tribal members voted in favor of the Seminole Constitution, which established the federally recognized Seminole Tribe of Florida. In 1970, the Indian Claims Commission awarded the Seminole of both Oklahoma and Florida collectively $12,347,500 for the land taken from them by the United States military, roughly $100 million today. In 2004, there were roughly 13,675 enrolled members of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Of those, roughly 2,000 were African Americans. The number of enrolled members of the Seminole Nation of Florida numbers roughly 4,000. Seminole warriors have fought in the Vietnam War and every recent war since the time, and there has even been 3 ships in the United States Navy named the USS Seminole. The first USS Seminole was launched in 1859 and was decommissioned in 1865. The second was built in 1879 and commissioned in 1898. The last, a Navajo-class fleet tug, was commissioned in 1940 and was part of the Pearl Harbor attack and served at the Battle of Tulagi in 1942, ferrying ammunition, gas, and troops. But on the 25th of October, 1942, the order to abandon ship was given at 11:20, and she sank about 1,000 yards offshore of Lango. Today, both Seminole nations are involved in gaming, and the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma own and operate 3 motor fuel outlets, 3 smoke shops, and a truck stop, and also offer its members various health programs, family services, and educational opportunities. Now I hope I did justice to the 5 civilized tribes. I just gave a touch of information. There is still so much more history and stories of each tribe, but I hope everyone learned something. Also remember that the 5 civilized tribes were not the only tribes removed to Indian territory. There were countless others: the Caddo, Comanche, Delaware, the list goes on and on, but the 5 civilized tribes are the most popularly discussed. I'll now go into more of the history of Indian territory, where each nation was located, and some general information. In the late 18th century, white settlers started migrating outside of the 13 original colonies, and the Native Americans that these white settlers came across were seen as just obstacles that needed to be conquered or pushed farther west. In 1787, the United States established the Northwest Territory, which encompassed the modern-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. This was the first organized territory of the United States. In 1803, the United States negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, and the boundaries of the United States were no longer the Mississippi River. According to Oklahoma history, President Thomas Jefferson envisioned a, quote, Indian colonization zone, or permanent Indian frontier. People believed that the removal of Indians west of the Mississippi would permanently resolve the conflict between the Native Americans and the white settlers who wanted to civilize the region. This concept of the Indian Zone was solidified during the time when John Quincy Adams was in office, and put into practice by the man we talked a lot about, Andrew Jackson. As talked about throughout this series, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave power to the president to sign treaties to remove Native American tribes from the regions east of the Mississippi River, and this led to years of removals. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave a legal settler the right to claim 160 acres of public land, if they can live on it and improve the claim for 5 years. Therefore, there was a large parcel of land that was ready to be claimed, and white settlers moved in hard and fast. On the 22nd of April 1889, the Oklahoma Land Rush took place. The territories open to these American settlers were the unassigned lands in the middle of the territory, the Cherokee Outlet, Cheyenne or Arapaho section, the Wichita and Caddo section, and the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache sections. People from all over the United States got their wagons ready with their families and belongings, as others got their fastest horses or caught trains in what they believed were the best point of entries, and at the sound of a gunshot, the lands were open. In 1890, the first Oklahoma territorial legislature founded 3 public universities: the University of Oklahoma on the 19th of December, 1890, Central State Normal School, known as the University of Central Oklahoma on Christmas Eve, and Oklahoma A&M, now known as Oklahoma State University on Christmas. Warning: this next part is heavy, just wanted to give you a heads up. According to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, by 1900, 20,000 children were in Indian boarding schools across the United States, which included schools in Indian Territory. Quote, Indian children were forcibly abducted by government agents, sent to schools hundreds of miles away, and beaten, starved, or otherwise abused when they spoke their native languages. According to the Department of the Interior, quote, the purpose of federal Indian boarding schools was to culturally assimilate American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children by forcibly removing them from their families, communities, languages, religions, and cultural beliefs. The stated purpose of this policy was to kill the Indian, save the man. In 1907, Oklahoma was established as a 46th state, and it effectively ended Indian Territory, and they became one. But as we all know, Native Americans still live there. In 1924, Oklahoma passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which gave all non-citizen Indians born in the United States citizenship. This also allowed tribal leaders to be elected on, instead of being appointed by the federal government. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 led to major changes related to tribal land ownership and self-government. It ended allotment of tribal lands, which had ripped apart reservations that led to devastating cultural and economic impacts. The act reorganized tribal governments and offered incentives for tribes to adopt U.S. government-style constitutions and governing councils. The act also set aside funds for Indian education and established an Indian hiring preference in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Termination Act of 1954 was the United States policy that ended federal recognition of tribes and their reservations. The intent of this policy was to assimilate Native Americans into American society. It dissolved tribal governments, required tribes to distribute their land to their members, and transferred criminal and civil cases on reservations to state government. It essentially took all the power away from the tribes, and stood until President Nixon renounced the act in 1970. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 gave Native American tribes more control over programs and services. This act aimed to improve the relationship between the tribes and the United States government. This next one isn't necessarily a huge law in terms of rights or boundaries, but the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 gave the rights of Native Americans across the United States to, quote, exercise their traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonies and traditional rites. This may not seem like a huge victory, but it was, because as you may have learned in this series, the traditions and cultures of these Native American people run deep and strong. This act gave them the ability to carry on the traditions of their ancestors that have been done for thousands of years. In 2020, Supreme Court case McGritt v. Oklahoma ruled that a large portion of eastern Oklahoma remained Indian country under Greek nation jurisdiction, meaning the tribal courts had authority over criminal and civil matters of the land. However, in 2022, the Supreme Court made a 5-4 ruling that upheld that the state could persecute non-native people on tribal lands. According to Oklahoma history, today, many tribes in Oklahoma host an annual Heritage Day, festival, or homecoming. Revival of arts and crafts also become important as forces to unify Native American communities, and also to generate income. Tribal historic preservation officers monitor threats to sites important to the nation's history. Many tribes have opened museums at tribal headquarters complexes, and most importantly, because the survival of language is key to the survival of a culture. Alright, let's talk about some of the battles and wars that took place in Indian Territory. And here's your warning, we discuss some graphic details. The first battle we will talk about is the Cutthroat Gap Massacre that occurred in 1833. This would have been in the southeastern part of Indian Territory in the Chickasaw Choctaw region. According to Oklahoma history, the massacre occurred east of Copperton in Kiowa County. The Osage Indians killed an estimated 150 Kiowas in the spring of 1833. The Kiowa had been encamped at the confluence of Rady Mountain Creek and the Washita River when an Osage presence was detected. Because the majority of the Kiowa warriors were away, conducting raids on the Ute, the Kiowa divided into groups and dispersed into the countryside. The Osage party trailed a band of Kiowas, led by Adaids, south from the Washita to the headwaters of Otter Creek. There, they attacked and indiscriminately slew. Some Kiowa were decapitated and their heads were placed in brass buckets. The Osage suffered 0 casualties and captured prisoners, horses, and the sacred taimi that the Kiowa used for their ceremonial Sundance. Kiowa and Osage relations improved after a Kiowa girl who was seized during the battle was returned by the Dodge-Leavenworth expedition in 1834. The Osage would return the Kiowa taimi in 1835, and the United States negotiated a lasting peace between the tribes in 1837. The next battle is the Battle of Wolf Creek that was in Northwest Indian Territory in the Cherokee Outlet region. According to the historic Fort Supply, in mid-June 1838, allied tribes of the Cheyenne and Arapaho attacked the confederated villages of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache. The Cheyenne and Arapaho attacked the villages in the morning, killing many people who were either berry picking along Wolf Creek or hunting buffalo in the nearby hills. On both sides, the fighting was done by individuals or by small groups, armed with traditional weapons such as lances and bows, but a few Cheyenne had guns. After a day of fighting, the villages still stood, but an unknown number of people lay dead. The scene of carnage was witnessed 3 days later by a U.S. Army Dragoon detachment that was escorting Osage chiefs to a council with the Kiowa. The next is the Battle of Little Robe Creek in the spring of 1858. This was located in northwest Oklahoma in the Cherokee Outlet. According to Oklahoma history, Captain John S. Rip Ford led a combined force of 102 Texas Rangers and 113 Native allies against the Comanche that had been conducting raids into Texas and was using the area as a staging ground. On the 12th of May, the Rangers attacked the large Comanche village northwest of the Antelope Hills. Comanche Chief Iron Jacket wore an old Spanish shirt of mail. Think of it like the old medieval chain-link metal armor. But Iron Jacket rode ahead toward the Rangers. He believed his medicine and armor would protect him from the enemy's bullets. Unfortunately, this was not true, and he was killed by a bullet. The village was captured, and it turned into a running fight in isolated groups. Comanche reinforcements arrived, but were repelled by the Texans. I'm not going to go into every single battle during the American Civil War that occurred in Indian Territory, but here are some of the bigger ones. The Battle of Locust Grove occurred on the 3rd of July, 1862. A Union force of roughly 250 men under the command of Colonel William Weir surprised a Confederate unit of similar size, led by Colonel James J. Clarkson. The Confederates tried to fight back, but offered little resistance and many fled the battlefield. Roughly 100 Confederates died, with another 100 being captured, including Colonel Clarkson. Union losses were 3 killed and 6 wounded. This led to a large scale of desertions among the pro-Confederate Cherokee. Next, the Tonkawa Massacre. The Tonkawa had been relocated from Texas to Indian Territory in 1859. We talked about the Tonkawa tribe in the Hugh Glass series. If you'll remember, they were rumored to be cannibals. Well, this rumor left them as an outcast, and their alliance with the Confederacy left a target on their backs. On the 24th of October, 1862, pro-Union natives attacked the Tonkawa tribe as they camped near present-day Anadarko in Caddo County. Roughly 150 Tonkawa died in the assault, and the tribe never fully recovered. Lastly, the Red River War. I'm going to be brief as this could be a whole series within itself. But the Red River War occurred during the summer of 1874, according to TexasBeyondHistory.net. The United States Army launched a campaign to remove the Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indian tribes from the Southern Plains and relocate them to Indian Territory. During the spring of 1874, a leader of the natives had emerged by a man named Ishtai of the Quahati band of Comanches. His medicine was viewed as being very strong, and he pushed for war against the whites. There had been much debate about what the natives should do, but the ultimate decision came to fruition: fight or starve. A plan was formed, and the natives would attack and destroy the new settlement of buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls. In the early morning hours of the 27th of June, around 300 native warriors, led by Ishtai and the famed Comanche chief, Quanah Parker, attacked the Adobe Walls outpost. Their plan was simple: catch the buffalo hunters by surprise and overwhelm them. There were 28 hunters that occupied the post, but they were well armed with long-range rifles and were able to hold off the native attack. With their failure at Adobe Walls, many of the natives spread out over the vast plains of Texas for one final grasp to their traditional ways of life. The U.S. Army made plans to subdue the Southern Plains tribes once and for all. The offensive utilized 5 columns converging on the general area of the Texas Panhandle and upon the upper tributaries of the Red River. The strategy aimed to fully encircle the natives of the region, thereby eliminating all gaps which they could escape. During the Red River War, as many as 20 engagements between the U.S. Army and natives took place. The war officially ended in June of 1875, when Quanah Parker and his band of Quahati Comanche entered Fort Sill and surrendered. Between 25 and 50 Native American warriors and roughly 10 soldiers lost their life. Since the time Europeans landed on the Atlantic shores of North America, they looked westward for land and resources. This brought them into the territory of Native Americans, which called this land home for hundreds of thousands of years. Though some white settlers attempted to make peace with the tribes, with some being successful, the struggle for power over resources ultimately led the Native Americans to be removed from their homelands. In the 1820s, the term manifest destiny was at the forefront of everyone's mind. Quote, "The mission to expand U.S. territory and settle throughout the North American continent." Many of the removal treaties promised protection for relocated tribes from hostile white settlers and other native tribes in the area. As the removed tribes began to arrive west of the frontier, the white settlers east of the border demanded protection from these tribes. This frontier border was essentially an invisible line that ran north to south, west of the states of Arkansas, Missouri, and Iowa. According to the National Park Service, this situation led to the development of a series of forts running north and south along the edge of the frontier. Since we are focusing on Indian Territory, there were 3 forts built in the territory. Fort Gibson, built in 1824 in Cherokee Territory, then Fort Towson, also built in 1824, and Fort Washita, built in 1842, were both in Chickasaw and Choctaw Territory. There was also Fort Smith that was on the Oklahoma and Arkansas border, and this will play a huge role for our upcoming deep dive series on Bass Reeves. White settlement in Indian Territory wasn't anything new. People had been moving farther and farther west every year. Once a new state was established, people would move a bit farther west in search for fertile lands. But what made Indian Territory so lawless? What made it different than any other place in the US? In the basic sense, Indian Territory became so lawless because it was outside of the jurisdiction of the United States government. For example, let's say the year is 1848, and an outlaw was peddling whiskey in Indian Territory. The deal goes bad, and this outlaw left 2 dead men on the trail. Well, he could not be prosecuted by the United States government, and seeing that the native tribes couldn't try non-native people, this was the definition of lawless territory. This led to a safe haven for outlaws, as Indian Territory saw little effective law enforcement. At the time, Indian Territory was known to be free of the, quote, white man's court. The only United States court office that held jurisdiction over the territory was the Western District of Arkansas that was located at Fort Smith, but the judge was corrupt. Following the Civil War, Indian Territory became filled with daring outlaws on the run or hiding from the law. The United States District Court for the Western District of Arkansas was established on the 3rd of March, 1851. According to Oklahoma history, it was created to enforce federal laws in 9 counties of western Arkansas and in Indian Territory. 2 additional Arkansas counties were added to the district in 1854, with just one judge presiding over both the eastern and western Arkansas judicial districts. But in 1871, Congress created a separate judgeship for the Western District and moved its headquarters from Van Buren to Fort Smith, Arkansas. The court held jurisdiction over all crimes committed by or against U.S. citizens in Indian Territory from 1851 to 1896. But the sheer size of the region made it difficult. The territory was over 74,000 square miles. For reference, modern-day Oklahoma is just under 70,000. Also, the American Indian courts, whose jurisdiction extended only to tribe members, complicated matters. For example, white settlers had often married within the tribes, and it created what the West deemed as half-breeds, someone who was half Indian and half white. If this person committed a crime in Indian Territory, which court jurisdiction did it fall under? Then to muddy the waters further, if the man commits a crime against a white man in Indian Territory, the man knew if he went to the court in Fort Smith, with racism at the time, he knew he was a dead man. Therefore, men like him would often evade capture and turn themselves into the Indian court, be tried there, and get a sentence. But the court in Fort Smith would often want to try the man, for the crime was committed against a white man, and it got very, very confusing. With the population and crime of Indian Territory increasing, President Ulysses S. Grant appointed Judge William Story as the Western District Judge in 1871. Almost as soon as he took office, reports of corruption took place. According to an article by Julia Bricklin on HistoryNet, Story was actively involved in politics and had supported Congressman Logan H. Roots in his run for re-election. When Roots was defeated, Story offered him a marshal position to, quote, soften the blow. He also hired 2 other men that he aligned with politically as commissioners. Little more than a year later, a United States attorney forced Roots out of his position of marshal, amid reports of fraud and soaring expenses. One of these reports of fraud came from a rival newspaper that Roots, with Story's approval, would have his deputies under him round up townsmen to vote for certain candidates in local elections. Also, the 2 hired commissioners were accused of withholding payments to witnesses, who had often traveled hundreds of miles to appear in court. Story himself would allow his marshals to charge the federal government for work they never did. The Daily Arkansas Gazette reported, quote, parties who never left town were allowed and paid full fees of all kinds for hunting after prisoners, and some parties were allowed and paid for arrests made at a distance, when they did not leave town or make any arrest. This made many to believe that Judge Story was getting kickbacks. This was just a few of the details of corruptions that led to Story's resignation in 1874, under the threat of impeachment. This led President Ulysses S. Grant to appoint Judge Isaac C. Parker. Beginning on the 10th of May, 1875, the day of Judge Parker's first day in court, he would hold the position for 21 years. Judge Parker would become one of the most famous judges of the West and earn the nickname Hanging Judge. By 1896, his last year in court, he had ordered 161 executions for murder and rape, 79 of which were carried out. But what was Indian Territory like crime-wise? What could he expect to walk into? Well, why don't we hear it from the man himself? Judge Parker did an interview in the St. Louis Daily Globe-Democrat on the 6th of July, 1875. The reporter asked him, quote, tell me something about the United States District Court over which you preside. I'm not going to give his entire answer as it is a long quote, but here are some bits of it that I think explain Indian Territory and its outlaws well. He starts by saying that the District Court for the Western District of Arkansas has jurisdiction over a part of the state of Arkansas and over the whole of Indian Territory. He also mentions that his court is the only United States court which exercises any jurisdiction over that country. Judge Parker then mentions some of the difficulty he faced in the courtroom. Quote, it is a matter of great difficulty to administer the law in the Western District of Arkansas because of the great distances witnesses have to travel to get to court, and of the unwillingness of witnesses in many cases to appear and give evidence. Frequently they are under the apprehension that violence will be offered to them by the friends of those against whom they are called on to testify. We've all seen this, right? In shows or movies where they use these scare tactics to intimidate a witness into not testifying against their family or friends. But this was no TV show. This was real life. This was a common occurrence of the West in general, but especially in Indian Territory. Outlaws would be brought in deep from Indian Territory, and they'd be let off from a lack of evidence because of the witnesses not testifying, either because it was too far for them to travel or intimidation factors. Witnesses sometimes had to travel over 400 miles to testify in court. Well, 400 miles back in the day wasn't a day trip. So who took care of the farm while they were gone? Who took care of their families while they were gone? Remember, Indian Territory wasn't this peaceful place that nothing ever happened. This was a frontier. Indian raids were common, and though you may own your property, you had to defend it. Judge Parker goes into talking about how he didn't try many natives, as his court was there to try white outlaws. But there was times where he would try a native when they committed a crime against a white settler. Quote, "The fact is that the murders and outrages that are committed in that country are committed principally by white desperados, refugees from justice from the states of Texas, Missouri, Arkansas, and the other states of the Union. It is true that this court has no jurisdiction over offenses committed by one Indian upon another. This may account for the small proportion of Indians who are brought to my court." Lastly, he talked about his job of being the judge over this territory. Quote, "I think the main object to be attained is to make the life and property secure in the Indian country. And while it is the duty of every officer of the court to practice the most rigid economy, yet enough expense should be incurred to bring every violator of the law to justice." I think this interview puts into perspective what the law was up against in Indian Territory. This was no easy job. From the judge to the marshals and their deputies, they had their hands full. So who are some of these outlaws in Indian Territory? Well, let's go into timeline sense. And no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through every single outlaw from Indian Territory. That would take up 94 episodes alone, but I do promise I'm going to cover a lot of them on this podcast with their own series. But here's a good description of what Indian Territory was like in terms of outlaws. It's from Art T. Burton's book, Black Gun Silver Star, which in our next deep dive on Bass Reeves, you'll hear plenty about. But in his book, he talked about a man named Buck Franklin, who wrote an autobiography about his life in Indian Territory. He was a Chickasaw freedman, and he talked about the outlaws of the territory, stating that, quote, "A conservative estimate of 90% of the wanted men were murderers, cattle rustlers, and horse thieves. The latter two crimes ranking in penalty with that of murder, as did bank robbery and highway robbery. Some of the men had prices on their heads, and the standard instruction was to bring them in, dead or alive." The first outlaw we will talk about is James Arseny, a Cherokee outlaw who was sentenced to death for a crime he committed years before when he was just 10 years old. If these stories are true, as you will learn, he would be the youngest person on record to have committed a crime for which he received the death penalty. According to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, it's believed he was born in 1862, but virtually nothing is known about his youth. The basic facts of the crime are fairly straightforward. Arseny and his friend, William Parchmill, came upon a man named Henry Figale. He was making a purchase in a store near Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. Arseny and Parchmill followed Figale as he headed to Fort Gibson, ultimately catching him a few miles from the fort. Though their original plan was just to rob him, he was shot multiple times and had his skull crushed with a rock. They dragged the body off the side of the road, stole his boots and his money, which is believed to be worth about $5 in today's money. Arseny initially denied any knowledge of the crime, but once his partner in crime, Parchmill, admitted to his role, the full story was revealed, and Arseny admitted that he was involved. But this is when the controversy starts. There are two versions of why, if the crime was committed in 1872, why the sentence wasn't carried out until 1885. The first was that the two were caught, tried, and convicted shortly after the murder. But they managed to escape jail and elude capture for over a decade, but they were recaptured and eventually executed. The second version is that the murder went unsolved for 12 years until 1884, when U.S. Deputy Marshal Andrews came to believe that Arseny and Parchmill were the killers. He got a warrant and was able to arrest the two men. In both the stories, the case went before hanging Judge Isaac Parker, and Arseny pleaded with him that he was just 10 years old at the time. But Parker was unmoved by his pleas and sentenced them to death, with it being carried out on the 26th of June, 1885. What are your thoughts? Email me, wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. The next is a gang of outlaws, the Cook Gang. According to Legends of America, though the Cook Gang was short-lived, lasting less than a year, these outlaws made themselves well known across the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations of Indian Territory in 1894, and damn did they cause some mayhem. It all started with a man named Crawford Goldsby, better known as Cherokee Bill. He will definitely be a deep dive in the future. But at the age of 18, he shot a man near Fort Gibson, and believing he had killed the man, he fled to the Creek and Seminole nations. There, he joined up with outlaws Jim and Bill Cook. In June of 1894, the trio was confronted at 14 Mile Creek near Tahlequah, Oklahoma, with a warrant for Jim Cook, and as one can imagine, a shootout took place. Cherokee Bill killed lawman Sequoia Houston, and Jim Cook was severely wounded. Bill Cook and Cherokee Bill took him to Fort Gibson. With the law hot on their trail, they were forced to leave him, and Jim was later captured by the law. Cherokee Bill went to his sister's place to hide from the law. While there, her husband, George Brown, a terrible drunk who Goldsby didn't like to begin with, started to beat his sister with a whip for not responding quick enough to one of his orders. Cherokee Bill walked up behind him and shot him to death. Shortly after, Goldsby and Bill Cook rounded up a gang, mostly consisting of black men with Indian blood, and began to terrorize Indian territory. Outlaws like Curtis Dyson, Skeeter Baldwin, Hunter Munson, Sam Verdigris Kid McWilliams, and many others. The gang started small, peddling some whiskey and stealing some horses, but soon were on to more serious crimes like robbing banks, stores, and stagecoaches, and they were ruthless in doing so, shooting anyone who got in their way. In the span of 4 days, from the 14th to the 18th of July, they held up a stagecoach, robbed a man, and held up a Frisco train at Red Fork. On the 31st of July, the gang stole $500 from the Lincoln County Bank in Chandler, Oklahoma, killing one person and wounding others. One gang member named Elmer Lucas was shot and captured. $500 in 1894 is roughly $18,500 today. Again, lawmen were hot on their trail, and they surrounded the gang at a friend's home. One lawman was shot and severely wounded. 2 outlaws, Lon Gordon and Henry Munson, were killed, and Ad Berryhill was captured, but the rest of the gang escaped. But the Cook gang was not finished yet. They robbed the J.A. Parkinson and Company's store in Muscogee on the 21st of September, fleeing with over $600, roughly $22,000 today. They only got more daring on the 11th of October, robbing the depot of the Missouri Pacific Railroad in Claremore, and less than 2 hours later, they robbed the railroad agent at Choctaw. Just 9 days later, they wrecked the Kansas City and Pacific Express, making off with the loot, and they just kept going. On the 8th of November, Cherokee Bill and several other gang members rode into Lenape and robbed the Shufelt & Son General Store. When an innocent passerby named Ernest Melton heard the commotion, he stuck his head in to see what was going on, and Cherokee Bill raised his rifle and shot him in the head, and the gang fled. U.S. Marshals got a tip on the outlaws' hiding place. Most of the gang members were arrested, including Bill Cook, but the ever-elusive Cherokee Bill managed to escape. He eluded the posse that hunted him down for a while, and his final act on the outlaw trail happened on the 31st of December when he acted alone and robbed a train station in Nowata. He eluded capture for a month longer and was finally captured on the 30th of January, 1895. He was delivered to Fort Smith and was tried before Judge Isaac C. Parker on the 26th of February, found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hung until he was dead, in front of hundreds of spectators on the 17th of March, 1896. When asked for his final words, it is reported that he said, "I came here to die, not make a speech." The last group of outlaws I'll talk about in this series is the Rufus Buck Gang. According to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, the Rufus Buck Gang was a group of young men from the Indian Territory who went on a criminal rampage in the summer of 1895. All 5 members were hanged on the 1st of July, 1895, in Fort Smith. Born in 1876, Rufus Buck was a black Native American of the Cherokee tribe who was angry about the white settlers who were moving into Indian Territory. So he assembled a gang of petty criminals, all young like himself, to quote, make a record that would sweep all the other gangs of the territory into insignificance. Other gang members were Lewis Davis, also Cherokee, Sam Sampson, and Naomi July, both Creek and Lucky Davis. Their crime spree started at Ocmulgee in the Creek Nation on the 30th of July, 1895, when Buck, Lewis Davis, and Lucky Davis mortally wounded John Garrett, a U.S. deputy marshal. They then came across a timber dealer named Jim Chafee near Ocmulgee, and by a 4-1 vote, decided to rob the man instead of murdering him. The gang then attacked a cattleman named Benton Callahan, whose father had expelled Buck from the Wealaka boarding school. They wounded Benton but killed his ranch hand Sam Houston. Seeing as their horses were growing tired from nonstop riding and outlawing, they seeked fresh ones and they raided the ranch of Gus Chambers on Duck Creek, but Chambers put up a fight. Chambers had a shotgun and put it to work, and though his house was riddled with lead, the gang left empty-handed. This next part is graphic, as it talks about sexual assault. Their next victim was a woman named Mary Wilson, a widow who was moving her household with the help of her son and another man. They robbed a party of their goods and raped Mary Wilson. The Ocmulgee Phoenix reported that they also killed a farmhand and raped a school teacher in the area. On the 1st of August, the Buck gang reached the home of Henry and Rosetta Hanson on the Snake Creek. They raped Rosetta and made Henry dance as they shot at his feet, then forced him to fight another white man until they both collapsed from exhaustion. They then moved on to McDermott and robbed a couple stores. On the 8th of August, while they were splitting up their ill-gotten loot from the store robberies near Flat Rock Creek, a posse of white marshals and Creek-like horsemen attacked and captured all of them except Lewis and Lucky Davis, who managed to escape but only for a short time. They were both captured on the 12th of August. All 5 were convicted of their actions against Rosetta Hanson and Buck, and both Davises were also found guilty of their murder of John Garrett. The Arkansas Gazette wrote, quote, "For downright deviltry and meanness, the Buck gang can probably lay claim to the blue ribbon over the other notorious combinations of outlaws with which the Indian country had been cursed for years past." The gang's lawyers appealed their convictions to the U.S. Supreme Court and to President Grover Cleveland, who refused to intervene. Shocker. On their way from the jail to the sentence hearing in late 1896, Buck and the Davises planned to seize their guards' guns and force them to remove their handcuffs to make an escape. But, quote, "After receiving a blow, each quieted down and gave no further trouble." Judge Parker sentenced them to hang until they were dead on the 1st of July, 1896. The 5 young men headed for the gallows at 11:07 p.m. on the 1st, and only a small group of onlookers watched on, and at 1:25 p.m., the trapdoor was dropped. Let's finish up this series with some famous lawmen of Indian Territory, the men tasked with riding into the land that had no laws, where the only rule was the rule of the gun, and where many of the outlaws would rather die with their boots on instead of swinging in front of a group of onlookers. These lawmen would ride hundreds of miles into the territory with a wagon, a posseman, and a cook, round up a group of outlaws, and take them back to Fort Smith to face Judge Isaac C. Parker. According to History.net, before the two territories merged to form the state of Oklahoma in 1907, at least 114 deputy U.S. Marshals died in the line of duty. To put this into perspective, according to the U.S. Marshal Service website, on the 11th of January, 1794, Robert Forsyth was killed while attempting to serve civil papers, being the first law enforcement officer in the United States to be killed in the line of duty. Since then, over 200 federal marshals, deputy marshals, special duty marshals, and marshal guards have given their lives in the service of their nation. 114 of these came from Indian Territory that had an existence of under 80 years. I'm going to talk about a few deputy marshals, focusing mainly on their work in Indian Territory, as they will be future episodes. To start is U.S. Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas. Henry Andrew Thomas was born on the 3rd of January 1850 in Athens, Georgia. He took on the nickname Heck at a young age and it stuck with him for life. His father and 2 uncles joined the Confederate Army at the outbreak of the Civil War, with each commanding their own regiment at some point during the war. When the war was over, Heck's father became the first city marshal of Atlanta, and at just 17, Heck joined the force. In his time serving in Atlanta, he earned the reputation as a fearless fighter after being wounded in the city's race riot. In 1875, Heck moved his wife, Isabel Gray, and family to Galveston, Texas, and worked as a railroad guard for the Texas Express Company, as her route was famous for train robbery attempts. In 1878, the Sam Bass gang attempted to rob the train near Hutchins Station. Thomas was injured during the shootout, but he did his job well, as the gang walked away empty-handed. Heck had placed cash in an unlit stove and used decoy packages in the safe. In 1886, Thomas was appointed as a U.S. Deputy Marshal and moved his family to Fort Smith, Arkansas, working under the hanging judge. For the next 7 years, he would earn the reputation of being one of the most efficient deputies working the territory. On his first trip out into the territory, he rounded up 8 murderers, a bootlegger, horse thief, and several other hardened criminals, and this would become just another trip for Heck Thomas. He would soon become a part of the famous Three Guardsmen, the trio of lawmen that became known as largely responsible for bringing law and order to the Indian Territory. The other 2 deputy U.S. Marshals were Chris Madsen and Bill Tillman. They worked together to bring in some of the most notorious and dangerous outlaws of the era. In 1893, the 3 Guardsmen were tasked with taming Perry, Oklahoma, which had sprung up overnight during the Oklahoma Land Run. It quickly became known as Hell's Half Acre. It had 25,000 people and 110 saloons, and the lawlessness ran rampant. And in this area of lawlessness, the famous dueling gang operated. Trained in bank robbers in Kansas, Texas, and Indian Territory for 4 years, the 3 Guardsmen constantly pursued him, but the gang always remained just one step ahead. That was until August 1896, when Heck Thomas led a posse that caught up with Bill Doolin. Remember how I said that outlaws in Indian Territory would rather shoot it out and die with their boots on, rather than face Judge Parker? Well, Bill Doolin was no different. When the outlaw was confronted by Deputy U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas and his posse, the outlaw tried to shoot his way out. Bill Doolin was killed in the shootout. Heck Thomas arrested more than 300 wanted men in Indian Territory. He was known to go after the most dangerous outlaws because the rewards were higher. Though he had success, he was wounded at least 6 times during gunfights. Next is a man with possibly the most badass last name in the Wild West, Sam Sixkiller. According to Legends of America, he was born in the Going Snake district of the Cherokee Nation in 1842. He joined a Union Indian Artillery Company that was commanded by his father. In 1875, he was appointed High Sheriff to the Cherokee Nation and Warden of the National Penitentiary. In 1880, Sixkiller became the first captain of the United States Indian Police, headquarters at Muscogee in Indian Territory. He also held a U.S. Deputy Marshal commission that allowed him to pursue outlaws out of Indian Territory into Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, and Missouri. He had 40 men under his command, and they were tasked with police in Muscogee, which was one of the most dangerous towns in all of the Wild West. His most famous event was his attempted arrest of Dick Glass, a notorious outlaw who led a gang of horse rustlers and bootleggers. In June of 1885, Sixkiller and his posse set up an ambush point for Glass and his gang in the Chickasaw Nation. When the outlaws arrived, Sixkiller shot and killed Dick Glass. But on the 24th of December, 1886, Captain Sixkiller was murdered in Muscogee by 2 men named Dick Vaughn and Alf Cunningham. Lastly, we have Bass Reeves, a giant of a man of his day, standing at 6'2". He was a skilled horseman, a crack shot with both hands, a man that was born a slave, fought in the Civil War, escaped after punching his slave master in the face and went to Indian Territory, and became known as one of the most baddest lawmen to ever do it. Or did he? Well, as stated before, our next deep dive series will be on the legend himself, Bass Reeves. But here is a little intro to his time as a lawman. He worked 32 years as U.S. Deputy Marshal in the Indian Territory, the only deputy to begin with Judge Isaac C. Parker's court and work until Oklahoma statehood in 1907, according to Oklahoma history. It's reported that he arrested more than 3,000 men and women during his time in Indian Territory, bringing in a wagon full of outlaws time and time again, killing more than a dozen in the line of duty. But are all the stories true about Bass Reeves? What about the recent series on Bass Reeves? Was that accurate? Well, come back next time and find out, when we dive deep into the life of Bass Reeves. Indian Territory and the stories within it, from the native tribes that were forced to relocate there, to the freedmen that escaped slavery, to the settlers that colonized the area, through all the flaws of the history of the United States, the amazing survival and perseverance of not just the 5 civilized tribes, but the roughly 50 tribes that were forced to leave the land that served as their homeland for thousands of years, the battles and wars to where each side thought they were fighting for the right thing, the outlaws that created the lawlessness, the lawmen who brought the law and order. The history of Indian Territory is woven into the very fabric of the United States of America and stands as a stark reminder of how far we've come as a society today. These events didn't happen 500 years ago. There were people born and raised in Indian Territory that learned about Pearl Harbor on TV, that may have watched the Space Shuttle or Challenger explode in 1986. It's crazy to me that people who watched the Comanche take to the warpath on the Great Plains lived to see the United States travel to space. We aren't that far removed from this period. Today, Native Americans are still fighting for their rights, their lands, and their culture. I hope you all enjoyed our series on Indian Territory. I know it wasn't a deep dive like I normally would, but I wanted to discuss it because I think it is a huge part of Western history of the United States. If you enjoy Wild West Deep Dives, please leave a rating. It is an amazing way for this podcast to grow, and don't be afraid to share it with a friend or enemy, whichever you prefer. Either way, I greatly appreciate it. Please email me with comments, corrections, concerns that you may have. You can email me at wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. We'll see y'all next time. When in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.